Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Critters 2, the main course. So evidently the first one had just done well enough for me just to say, you know what, let's go into this. Let's go into the franchise. Why not? Kind of see where things are heading into. Some people might actually enjoy the sequel more, just because at some points it does get a little bit more we take some risks here. Like at one point, we basically have like a Playboy model as one of the actual bounty hunters in this movie, or whatever they want to be called. Like I guess we can call them like galactic bounty hunters or whichever. Um, but yeah, we just straight up have a woman with just basically nothing on, like in an entire like just out in the middle of nowhere, just like spot. And this woman is like, man, I'm just gonna like just start walking on. And I'm like, wow, okay. Um, I actually had a lot of fun with the sequel. Like, I really, I also spotted that it seems like they didn't go with the whole they didn't go with like the needle or the porcupine like thing in this movie. I guess they just decided, well, like there's a lot more critters in this movie, so I think people should be fine with that rather than them having this kind of distance attack, which a lot of people might have seen in the very first film. And like, okay, I guess they just kind of focused on the fact that like there's just a lot of them in this movie, and like that should be the whole uh like part of this franchise. Like I kind of wonder if they like eventually decided that like to not risk this special effect, or maybe that would cost too much, or like where they decided from the first one to the second one, where they just decided that they're just gonna like have it be a much more simpler approach, but also to try to do something different also in this movie, which is basically just like all the critters combining into one as some gigantic ball of a thing, which you see here, which happens towards the tail end of the movie. Uh, but yeah, I had a lot of fun with this one compared to the first one, just because I didn't understand what I was getting into in the first one, and then like the second one, I'm like, man, this is like a lot of fun. And a lot of people would probably feel differently. They'll be like, whoa, like no, like this movie is much more scarier than the first one, and ba 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 ba, because like there's a lot of build up to this movie in the first one, and there's a lot of waiting in the first one, where I think in this sequel one we kind of do get to the point to just like really just say like, hey man, like in this movie we're actually gonna like we're not gonna halter so much. Like yeah, like there's a lot of like people are coming back to town kind of film, so it's like they're back at it again. Like I hate that phrase, but I also just make fun of it whenever there's a sequel where like somebody like there's a whole bunch of like homecoming like things, or there's like a return of a bunch of people from a town. I'm just like, why do they always have to do that in a sequel? Like they have to like really give this person like some real like they have to like really make this person special that they've kind of come back to this town. And plus also I think we have Bradley Brown that is in this movie that has to like come on to a bus, and by the end of the movie has to kind of conveniently like leave town. um but yeah, you would have thought that Bradley would have just been like, dude, he's like the hero of this town, and so like this guy should just like be in this town forever. Like they also didn't cement that there was going to be like eggs of these critters towards the end of this movie, so I'm kind of curious how they go about doing a another movie of this. Probably they finally just decide, you know, we're just gonna do like maybe a straight up reboot, or like I don't know if a lot of people are going to be in the third one that were in the second one, because like I just didn't check that out. But without a doubt, more than likely, uh, if this does go well, if this review goes well, I'm doing the third one and I'm doing the fourth one. And if people want, I'll even review the show. Because good grief, if something goes well on this on this channel, then by golly, we're gonna keep going into things. We're gonna have fun with them also. So, but yeah, so really, I would say that this movie is like has a real solid fun factor to it, and like I would say that this is a solid. Um, I would say it's a pretty solid, like good, even more, almost more than good movie. Just because there's like, of course, like a raunchy part of it too, where we have this woman in all of her glory, kind of grace her presence through this film. Um, it's a movie that just feels fun, and so that equals getting on to almost like being a great film, just because uh, it realizes, okay, we need a bigger like scale of this, and uh but also like it like I think also the bounty hunter uniforms have changed from like the original way that they did the uniforms to now like this approach, I guess, because like these uniforms might have been just cheaper. I don't know. Maybe they might have been more expensive. Maybe they couldn't have duplicated the process of the bounty hunters. Plus, also like supposedly there have been quite a bit of time that has passed between first one and this one, because of course you can tell because Bradley is much older. But also, like I think that's also just a convenient way to go into here and just be like, okay, that's why everything has kind of drastically changed with the bounty hunters or whatever. Um, but at least we still have some people coming back from this original film. So, with that said, teeing it up, what is to go on into this sequel? So, the original movie, we just stayed into this house, and then eventually the bounty hunters are to eventually go after these things. Well, in the sequel, like we have much more of these critters, like going after like an entire town, which I think is a lot more fun. Like this kind of comes off to being a much more kind of like Gremlins kind of movie. Uh, and so I'm assuming that eventually it's going to head that way to where it's eventually going to like come off as a much more Gremlins like thing. But we have these things that tend to want to devour everything that eventually they see. But like a lot of people could probably say also that maybe they found like the critters not as like as well put together as the in the original movie, which I can understand that because like a lot of these critters have to go through like several amounts of transformations in this film, and so like people can say certain things are weaker than whatever, but like I'm sure they had to put a lot of money in this movie compared to the original. um and plus also it did well, so to each their own. So anyways, but yeah, so we have Bradley who ends up returning from off of this bus to make his way to his grandmama, because evidently Bradley's whole entire like family, I guess, is in the city now, so he has to come back to visit his grandmama, I guess, and so that leads to all of a sudden having some people that are here kind of calling Bradley like a town hero or just kind of wanting to hear his tale of like the critters, or in the bounty hunter's case, Kreitz. So yeah, we also have a very drastically different kind of approach to the bounty hunters in this movie. We actually have a sequence of them like going and fighting intergalactic alien in like in their trials of like, so it actually seems like they're actually doing something and then coming back to Earth, because eventually those eggs from the very first movie are now going to eventually hatch. Coincidentally, we're tying Easter into this film, which I thought was really kind of just a fun kind of way to get to the fact that like, hey, eggs and like, so yeah, like, so but I think we also have like some pretty actually decent jokes in this movie. There's like we have the preacher that is doing his sermon, and all of a sudden like whatever he is to say is kind of to like affect what is to go on in this story. But anyway, so yeah, we just have a lot of fun with this movie. it's really good. I really enjoyed it. So really, like, it all just depends on if you were okay watching the first movie, go ahead and check this one out. Like, I think reasonably, uh, like, I like the fact that it doesn't feel like an overwhelming buildup of this movie, where it's just kind of like they have to like try to like do all these like kind of effects to just kind of build up the suspense. Like, I just like the fact that they just go into this and they just kind of go, oh, okay, we're gonna do this now, and drastically change what we did in the previous movie. So with that said, let's go into that double five time territory. I apologize for how long it took for me to talk about this movie cryptically, but I really enjoyed it. Go ahead and check it out. Because it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time you can do spoil this movie. So if you just popped into here and you didn't check out the very first review, go ahead and check out these movies. More than likely, you might see them in two different apps. You can probably dare in fact watch either one of these in either an app called C Movies, letters C Movies. You could probably see anything for absolutely free. If anything, I think there just might be a fee if you want to just remove the ads, but that's about it. That's your choice. Also, there's another app called Fox HD Movies that I've been reliably using, and you could probably go into this and a number of Critters things, hopefully, for absolutely free. So, with that said, spoilers. So going at the very beginning of this, what we have here is a failure to communicate. What we have is to showcase that from the very original movie to this one, there's supposedly a 2-year gap. So why is it that these critters took 2 years to hatch themselves? I don't know, but I guess they were just waiting for Bradley Brown to come back into town, if you know what I mean. So Bradley is to make his way back to town via this bus, and bizarrely, Bradley is the only one that is on this bus. So we have this bus driver that is talking to Bradley and mentioning like, hey, yeah, like there's some story about this town about some kid who had saw some like porcupine monster, and like I guess supposedly it was from this Brown family. You wouldn't have happened to known anybody from that family now, would you, kid? And Bradley is just like, no, I wouldn't know anything about that, covering up the name on his bag that says Bradley Brown. So Bradley is to get dropped off at his town, and immediately once he is to like be dropped in the middle of this town, all of a sudden we start to see like little people here and there. Like we start to see like a newspaper spot that is to eventually have a girl named Megan that's going to consistently be tied to Brad throughout this movie. There is Mr. Morgan and I think Sal, who are to kind of put the newspaper together, and eventually like one small little detail ends up having them getting very confused where the heck to put all the like the newspaper clippings that eventually they're going to have to show this whole newspaper together. So all of a sudden, Megan is so excited that Brad is here because supposedly, like, the biggest story that this town was to ever have was all about those critters and how, like, this kid had seen this. But, like, really, I guess when Bradley was probably just try and sell this story, probably no one was going to probably believe him just because of it seeming, like, really far-fetched. Like, I guess it's just you had to be there kind of thing because you wouldn't have believed it otherwise. If a bunch of critters just attacked some farm, like, you probably wouldn't believe it because like it's just a small portion of town and it's one family against the fact of like, well, shouldn't your house be like destroyed like how it was, but eventually the house got like put back together. So like a lot of people are very skeptic about Bradley, and eventually once Megan does like talk to Bradley about, hey, you're the critters guy, you're the guy with the story, and Bradley was like, yeah, that was just some like young kid's dream that didn't work out. And but weirdly enough, Bradley still has the communicator that Ugg gave him in the original movie. And eventually, once they are to desperately find out that critters are back in town, and so is Bradley, Bradley's going to have to go and find that communicator and try to talk to the exterminators or the bounty hunters again. So let's put a pin in that and let's go into both the story of how we get the critters to kind of transition into a spot, and then let's also get into the bounty hunters. So we have a guy named Wesley who is to take a man named Quigley, I believe, and take him into this barn that no one has been in the barn for 2 years. So Wesley is telling this guy, hey man, like, I have some unique eggs for you, and like, hey man, we could just trade for these. And so this antique salesman is like, oh, I guess like these eggs do seem fairly rare. And of course, these eggs are the eggs of the critters. So it seems like there is like a way larger stack of eggs in this movie compared to I think the original. Just because like I think they just wanted to just have more critters in here. They're just like, hey man, if we have a freaking bigger budget for this movie, and this movie did really well, so let's have a lot more critters. And like if anything, like this is going to be pretty easy to pull this off with a lot more of these, so we can make a lot more. I think like in the original, it kind of felt like there was maybe a handful, maybe like 4 or 5 or something like that. Um, and then like a huge puppet of a critter also. So, but yeah, so Wesley is to go and give this guy these eggs to be put into this antique shop. It kind of looks more uh, like a garage sale more than anything else because it just looks like disheveled. There's a whole bunch of just garbage all over the place. So Wesley ends up trading this guy with these eggs that he ended up finding. He trades him in for like a thing of like cheap beer and a bunch of Playboys, which leads us to eventually having a centerfold eventually being one of the bounty hunters. Because what ends up happening is Wesley is to drive off with this beer and these Playboys, and all of a sudden one of the Playboy magazines goes flying out of the car. And so that lands us to eventually having the bounty hunters eventually picking up. Charlie ends up picking up one of the magazines because he's back in town also. And we have one of the bounty hunters who ends up changing. Lee ends up changing into one of these Playboy centerfolds, but we'll get to that. So we have the bounty hunters that are to go on to try and grab one of like a very disgusting, of course, like alien like, and they're kind of running through this one like this place, and then all of a sudden they end up killing this alien, and they're like, yeah, we did it. It seems like Charlie is to be kind of like the decoy of all this because it seems like he's running off. And so but eventually they end up nailing this ugly looking thing, and just like shoving it into like some like alienistic freezer that I guess is to just be like, hey man, like these are all the heads of all the stuff that we've caught and killed, and this is just another one of those. So that leads us to have a uh, an alien person that is telling these bounty hunters what to do, called Zanti or Zanti. I don't know the pronunciation, but like very different alien than in the first movie, which I kind of like. So I'm like, are they still going with the whole like alien prison thing, or is that just like, no, they're gonna squash that, and then they're just gonna now just like, hey, hunt all these things down and just kill them? Like, you're basically just now uh you're basically just outer space terminators now. Like you're basically just outer space uh bug uh like Terminator, bug, whatever, like bug killers. Like they're basically the equivalent of that. So but this time around, it feels like their gadgetry looks a lot more like a proton pack on the back of them. Like except for it's way smaller, but like it looks like much more like a reasonable or rational approach to their like equipment in this movie compared to I think the first one, where it seems like it looks a lot cooler. It just looks like a lot better. With the exclusion of their outfits that just kind of look weird. But anyways, but they have to go through like a good decent rung of kind of outfits because eventually every single person that eventually Lee is to change into, and they do that quite a few times in this movie. Um, like they have to like basically re wardrobe up these people every single time. So I guess there's quite a bit of money spent in just like, hey man, like we're gonna need to change consistently the Lee's outfit, so might as well just go ahead and just like try to find fabric that's just cheaper to put together than what we were doing in the original movie, because that probably ate like a ton of their budget, was to probably just have to come up with these like outfits that hopefully can fit like the same X amount of people. Um, and if not, then like really they should have went with uh, whatever. Anyway, so but we have like the same like singer from the very first movie that is to be Ugg in this film. So I'm like, okay, so he's back. Charlie's back, who is kind of the drunk who decided to go with the aliens, and we have Lee, who is still trying to come up with some kind of disguise because there is nothing really that Lee could latch on to that's going to make him like stay a certain thing. So yeah, so what ends up happening is like eventually the bounty hunters are going back after the Krites because we find that bizarrely the Xanta person is to tell them that Krites are still on planet Earth, and so they have to go and like investigate and find where they are. So they're like, oh, okay. So that leads us to eventually having the bounty hunters making it on Earth, and the first thing that Charlie is to grab is a Playboy magazine, and that changes Lee to become this like Playboy centerfold. That obviously like she rips like her entire outfit off to where you could just kind of see like underwear, and that's about it. Uh, because evidently this woman's body like didn't fit for this outfit. So we have Charlie who's telling Lee, "Hey, you're gonna need to put this outfit back on. Like, try to like have it fit you somehow, because like you can't just go walking all the way through this town and just like wearing nothing." So, but yeah, so we start eventually the first kind of real prominent thing that the town is starting to see of critters, but like they don't eventually like. Let's explain what happens. So we have this new sheriff in town because evidently the old sheriff, who isn't the same sheriff from the first movie, uh, but also bizarrely he had not been sheriff for 2 years. So I guess they were trying to like, oh, no one will remember that this is the one sheriff that whatever. Like I guess they just probably like they probably had to do a lot of retconning, or they probably had to do a lot of stuff to just justify things in this sequel movie. That coincidentally, maybe the sheriff just had gotten this position after the end of the first one, but then all of a sudden, like he got booted out of the whole thing. I don't know. It's weird. So. And eventually, we have some people in town going to the sheriff, and like the sheriff wants nothing to do with this town. Like we have the one woman called Sal that is to come to the sheriff and say, "Hey, Bradley's back in town." It's like, "Hey, like uh like, hey sheriff, like come and be a part of our town. And the sheriff is like, dude, like I got my I got my game shows to watch. Like I don't like I want nothing to do with you people. So we have this new sheriff who decides to put on this bunny costume to try to be like nice and whatever. And so what ends up happening is we have this one grandmother uh, who is to buy these Easter eggs from this antique guy, and so she's to have like a good decent like stack of them all over the town. And what eventually ends up happening is the antique guy goes into eventually checking on these eggs again, and all of a sudden all of them hatch. And so we have this guy who quickly all of a sudden gets up onto the stool. He's like, oh my god! And so all these critters start eating away at this stool till eventually, like, this stool, of course, falls over. And so, like, all the critters just start eating like this guy who is now fallen over on this stool, which I'm like, oh, that's too bad. So like, and there was also this one part where Wesley was to open this door for this dog to just appear and like, oh, rah, 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 rah. And like, I guess for a lot of people, that could be like a scary part to a lot of people. Cause like for me, I was just like, okay, wasn't expecting that. But like, I was just like, I was kind of prepping myself. I'm like, okay, when are they going to have some like there's got to be some jump scare like coming soon to theaters near you, but like kind of wasn't expecting the dog to just kind of pop rah rah rah, rah like what the was that. So but yeah, so eventually what ends up happening is the critters end up sadly I think eating the dog and like eating most of his dog food. And that's when the guy realizes like, oh crap, these things are like I guess whatever these things were, they hatched. So and so then this guy died. So pushing on, so eventually we start having this like Easter thing with all these young kids because we have this grandmother that I guess is like babysitting a lot of these kids, giving them all like vegetarian food and like stuff like that. And so eventually Bradley is to come home to his grandmama, and so all of a sudden he's like eating like finishing eating a burger, and then he realizes that she's gone like vegan or whatever, and so he's like just starting to scarf down the food. But funny enough, we have his grandmother who still like notices like, you've been eating red meat, I'm sure you have. So but yeah, so we lead into eventually having this grandmother buying these eggs before they hatch. Like she ends up getting half of them. And so she eventually just like starts like taking these eggs and kind of planting them like you normally would Easter to eventually have the kids, I guess, find them. But I guess some kids eventually find these eggs and start like kind of playing with them, which eventually leads to eventually these eggs like eventually hatching. So one girl is to get this egg from this old lady, and so she takes it as well as this chocolate bunny. And so what ends up happening is this egg eventually hatches while this girl is going to sleep. And because we have this father who is the news who's the newspaper guy who is to kind of put this girl into bed, and because she's like falling asleep while she's eating her dinner. And so she goes and she sleeps, and this thing eventually hatches and is like underneath her bed. And so we consistently have this girl who just like keeps moving her leg or her feet while she's sleeping. And immediately a lot of people are thinking like, oh my god, they're gonna have like this girl get eaten by this critter. What an awful thing to do in this movie. Yeah, they don't do that. So what ends up happening is the father ends up going to check on his daughter while like she's sleeping, and all of a sudden he accidentally steps on this critter and kills it. And he's just like, oh, like I must have crushed one of your Easter like candies, I'm sorry honey. Because like there's some like green goop on the bottom of his foot, which is just the critter. So pushing on. So eventually we have this sheriff that is the bunny that is to eventually I guess there's a part that is to rip in his costume, and so he's kind of terrified that eventually his like wang will be popping out of this costume. So what ends up happening is we have one of the critters, because like this sheriff is to kind of like open his head part to just kind of see this egg, and he's like, what is up with this egg? All of a sudden we have one critter going through this sheriff's costume and just eating him up, and there's nothing that this guy can do about it because like he's going to die. So while that's going on, we have the Reverend who's doing his Easter sermon. It's like, well, yeah, it looks like now, since like we have a holiday here, everyone's decided that they're now religious, huh? And like kind of giving them crap just because I guess they don't go into like church every single Sunday or whichever. It's like, I guess since it's a small town and whatever, but still, like, like, hey man, it's a holiday, so like at least they showed up at church. So but yeah, but this guy is talking about like resurrection and all kinds of stuff. And so he's also mentioning that there was a man in white that was to cause a stutter, which I guess he's referring to Jesus. But all of a sudden, I'm like, Jesus! Because all of a sudden we have the sheriff who ends up crashing through this window and just falling over, and he's dead. He's like, and like everybody's like, whoa! Like I thought it was like funny. I was like, yeah, of course there's gonna be a man in white. Uh, but I wasn't scared at that moment. I was just having a little fun. So, but yeah, so we go on here, and so we have Bradley that's thinking that the critters are back, that the sheriff is dead, and so they need to go to the other sheriff. So Bradley goes to this other sheriff who I guess has retired. And so Bradley and Megan are telling this guy, like, dude, you need to come back to town. And the sheriff is like, dude, I'm gonna freaking leave town. Like, if anything, like, if there's something really going down, like you say, I should probably just get the heck out of here. So, like, Bradley is having a sneaky suspicion that the critters are coming back. So, but it just leads to us, like, having this old lady who is to have one of the critters, like, quite possibly more than that, going through her home to where she's kind of like bipping one with like a broom, which I'm like, dude, I would not be bipping anything. No, you are crazy, old lady. I guess you're much more courageous than I would be. I would just be like, oh, there's something that doesn't seem normal in my house. Frickin', I'm out of my house then. See you later. Like, I am just not gonna go out of my way to figure out what this weakness of this thing is if it's not a normal, seemingly animal, whichever. Uh, anyways, so we have eventually this old lady who's like closing the door of her home to not let these critters out, and eventually Bradley is to go into the house as well, and he's kind of scrambling for his his whatever device to talk to the bounty hunters. And so what ends up happening is Bradley is to like not be able to figure out what button to actually do to like summon these guys, because it's like, dude, I haven't done this in 2 years. So Bradley has hit the one button because the critters are coming, and so Bradley is to luckily hit the one button that is to quickly just, I guess, send the bounty hunters right then and there to start killing off all of these critters. Like, they blow through this door, and they just start killing all of these critters. And so Bradley's like, yeah, I love these guys. And, like, the two women are just like, what? Huh? Like, they're just so like baffled and confused because Bradley's has had experience with this before and they haven't, so this is brand new to them as well as a number of people. So so of course we have the bounty hunters still calling these krites, but of course we're just like, yeah, critters, and they're like krites. so, so they go through the bounty hunters just consistently have this one line, and they're like, we need to get the krites, we need to kill the krites, we need to, like, yeah, krites, yeah, we get it, we get that you like are on a mission. So but yeah, so eventually it starts leading to them like having the bounty hunters having to like take these things down like everywhere. uh and it eventually also leads to them going through this fast food joint that I guess is to be the spot called the Hungry Heavers, the Hungry Hivers, Hungry Hivers. I think it's Hivers because I think they have a whole song at the end of the credits. Um, it just seems weird. So like we have this one manager that's there that actually was in the movie Grease. Um, like he's kind of asking Megan about her order and if she wants anything else with it. I'm like where is this guy? Like this guy looks familiar to me. He's wearing like glasses. I'm like, why does this guy look so familiar to me? And like I'm like, oh yeah, he was in Grease. Like bizarrely, the first Grease movie with John Travolta. So, but yeah, so we end up having eventually Lee, who is to like Lee and Ugg are going through and just blowing up all of these critters in this one fast food joint, and then excuse me, and then all of a sudden Lee just becomes like the fast food joint manager, and then we just see this fast food joint manager who is all of a sudden like trying to take down um these critters, but eventually what ends up happening is Charlie is starting to see that Lee is changing again, and then like Lee ends up changing like into almost Freddy Krueger, and Charlie's like, no, don't change into Freddy Krueger, change back into Magazine of Woman. Like change back to that, so at least you can have like there can be a much more pleasing visual and you won't freak everyone out. And plus also I don't think they have the money for Robert Englund to be in this film. So Lee changes back into the centerfold, and so Charlie's like, "Oh, thank God!" like, like, hey, we didn't have the money for Robert Englund, but also we didn't have the money for somebody to look like Freddy Krueger, but also like good-looking woman back into fray. But sadly enough, like the most heartbreaking part about this is we have Lee, who eventually ends up getting attacked by all the critters. Like eventually the critters go and swarm on Lee and start like eating her up to where there's only like a hand left. I'm like, you couldn't have left anything else. It's a joke. It's a funny joke. But anyways, so Lee like was sadly killed, and that just makes Ugg just like really just so upset that eventually he just completely loses his form and then just goes back to like no eyes, no face, no nose person. And so we have Charlie that is just like, oh my God, am I gonna have to do this all on myself? Like, am I gonna do this alone? Like, am I just gonna like be like the only one left out of this? so, uh, so yeah, so we end up having the sheriff also coming back in town and trying to kill some of these critters in a very like Western cowboy kind of style, which I think is kind of cool. Which is to showcase us, hey, the sheriff's back in town and he's gonna help, like take out these things. So we all push these people all on into this church, and so we have people just kind of don't like the fact that there's certain people like telling them what to do. Like we have Bradley that is kind of telling the town what to do because he's experienced this before. And of course, like every single thing that we've ever seen in our lives, if somebody has previous XYZ experience, like Critters in this movie, everyone always ignores that one person and it's just like, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want and I'll end up dead because I don't want to listen to experienced person or these bounty hunters, or I don't want to listen to the sheriff. I just want to do like something on my own and probably end up dead. Um, like it was a really cool scene where like Bradley and Megan were trying to like run out of where they were to be running out of their home, and we had the one critter that ends up like grabbing onto the tire, and then like the critter ends up like blowing up. Like that looked really cool. Um, but like that whole sequence that they're trying to run out of their house, like I thought that was really fun. Like the whole car sequence, the whole truck sequence was really cool. But anyways, so pushing on. So what they all decide to do is Bradley's plan is like, well, hey, like we have this huge giant like freezer of a place that has a bunch of meat, right? And the critters just love meat. So how about we do this? How about we just like make this one huge place for these critters to all to want to go, and like they'll go and they'll eat this meat, and while they're doing that, we'll have like dynamite and explosives all like plastered all over the place for them to just go in there, and then we'll just blow them up. And so we have one of the guys who's like, well, who's gonna go into this suicide mission? And it's like, what suicide mission? Like it didn't really seem like anybody had to like forcibly go in there to force these things in there, so what are you talking about? But what ends up happening anyways is, so all of a sudden we have this one massive critter that is telling all the other critters what to do. Like there was also one fun point in the restaurant where one of the critters was to lose its hairline and just be like bitchin'. And so, but anyways, like I guess I cussed there. Oh no, like my video, whatever. So I said one cuss word. So uh but we have this one bigger critter that is leading all the other critters to go to this spot, and then we end up finding out that the big critter is actually just Ugg, who decided to just change into a critter to like lure these things in. And so they explode the whole like warehouse thing, and they think like, yeah, we did it, like, yeah, like very few people did, but we did it. Like, so uh so they just assume, oh yeah, like we're done now, we finished this, like they're dead. And all of a sudden they're kind of worried that the spot is gonna like explode again. We have both Megan and Bradley that are almost to kiss, but then all of a sudden they decide like, oh, like they hear something. Uh, all of a sudden that's when we find out that all the critters combine together in a Voltron-like way and decide to just band together to just become this giant critter ball, which obviously when you kind of see it in like scenes where it's just a ball rolling, it's obvious that they kind of like there are certain kind of ways in which this is approached, but like, but man, like, is this a really complicated thing to put together? And so let's freaking applaud them for trying this. They tried really hard to do this movie, and like at the end of the movie they had to like thank this town for putting this whole thing together. So uh but yeah, so we just have this thing like rolling through town. And so what ends up happening is Charlie ends up taking his spaceship, and he ends up like ramming it into the critter ball, and then this thing just explodes. And so all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my god, like Charlie just saved our town, like he did it, like he beat this thing. And so all of a sudden we have Ugg, who just turns into Charlie, and we have Megan telling Brad like, "Hey, look at Ugg. He's now Charlie." And so all of a sudden we have like, since everything is to be done, we have both the sheriff and we have Ugg, or we have sheriff and we have Brad, who ends up going and like, well, I guess like this is all that we had time for. Let's go back onto the bus and let's leave, because like that's all we were here for. This little blip of time, to just take down these critters. And so what we end up finding out is that Charlie is still alive. Even though he like exploded the whole ship of a thing, like he's still alive. And so we have like Charlie just kind of talking to Charlie, and so like that's a nice little moment that we have there, where so we have like two Charlies. So what eventually ends up happening is I guess the old sheriff ends up giving the sheriff badge to Charlie, just say like, "Hey man, like you're the new sheriff in town." And so I guess Charlie is to, I guess, decide to just not go with the bounty hunters to like go back in space. I guess he's just decided that he needs to go back into town to just like be like with his town again. So really that's just where we kind of just leave off. I guess like the one bounty hunter who I guess is to be Ugg is to probably maybe go back into space to like regroup and like get some more bounty hunters or whatever. Um, but it'll be kind of interesting to see like what happens in the sequel, like whether or not like who eventually comes back as a bounty hunter or whatever. Um, but yeah, like we'll see kind of what the sequel holds for this if people are interested. But I'm gonna get out of here. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this movie. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully, I put enough details in here because some people are just like, "Well, yeah, but this part and did." I get it. There's a lot of people that are just like, "Well, like he didn't do it exact way, whatever." But like I did, I think I did a bulk of the movie, because that's always the thing. Like that's always why I always apologize and I always whatever. And if I have last minute things, like that's always why I kind of halter in the very end of this, because I'm like, did I forget something? Did I whatever? Because I know there's gonna be one person that's gonna be like, well, you forgot about this one scene that ties this whole movie together, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that yeah, there was a part of that, and that's why I go through like memorizing it or just kind of going off one viewing and like replaying it all just to. Um, but anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.